Okay, so continuing on, we talk about the functions of life. So, what is it that makes you alive? Right? So, this is a list that you should know and you should understand what each one of them means, right? And so, when we look at this, in class, I often ask students, come up, tell me what keeps you alive. So, here we have organization, responsiveness, metabolism, growth, development, and reproduction, and movement. And I refer to page 16, okay? So we want to figure out, why are these things important? Why not anything else? So I said, what has organization got to do with life? Well, it turns out you have to have right things in certain places, and they are in optimal places as in your body in order to get the functions done, right? So there has to be some logic to the layout of this, right? So we just looked at this idea of organization from the atom to the cell to the tissue to the organs and organ systems. So that's one aspect of organization that, again, life depends on. And then I go on to say that, we also look at this organization, and we looked at this in lab, right, that the body was divided into compartments, right? And these compartments exchange chemistry, and they do this not just randomly, again, I say selectively. That means there's choices involved. And just to get you starting to think, what is the smallest organized compartment? Well, it turns out that's the cell. And so the cell will become the unit of life. It's going to have all these characteristics as we continue studying it, all right? So metabolism, right, next on the list, and extremely important. I mean, this is why we really want to address this one up front, and then we'll follow the rest. Life is about acquiring energy, transferring energy, using energy, right? And energy, the dry definition, is the ability to bring about change or get work done, right? Basically, the capacity or ability to bring about change or do work. And that, I say right away that this organization, I said, that's part of being alive, actually only occurs because of energy, right? And there are laws of physics that talk a lot about energy, right? The thermodynamic laws. And the first law, of course, states that energy is not created or destroyed, that energy is transferred on this planet, right? And then the second law of thermodynamics addresses the idea of organization and entropy. So the take-home message is that, again, you have to put energy into staying alive constantly, because what is spontaneous is everything to become disorganized and kind of fall apart. So where does that energy come from? Well, you eat food, right? You take in calories, and you get molecules with that as well. So you have building blocks of matter, and you have energy to help, right, move these molecules around and assemble them and so forth. So I say your energy allows movement on the gross level, like you're moving the body or moving the blood when the heart pumps, right? Energy helps to do the synthesis reactions we talk about in Chapter 2. Energy has to be put into that. Energy helps to maintain structures, right? It keeps things organized. And so energy keeps you basically functioning, right? It keeps the substances flowing around in the body. It keeps you in an organized manner, and in turn, this allows you to do your jobs. Metabolism is a sum of all chemical reactions in the body. But to kind of point that out a little better, we talk about metabolism as a balance of catabolism and anabolism. So what are these? Well, anabolism, again, you'll see this in Chapter 2, are synthesis reactions. They are reactions in which we are building things up. And catabolism, or catabolic, are degradation, decomposition reactions. Okay? So here's why, again, we are talking about energy still, is that catabolic reactions, when molecules are breaking apart and getting simpler, as they break apart, they release energy. That energy is often used by some anabolic process that's occurring at the same time, because anabolic processes require energy as well. But there's not a direct transfer, right? So the energy here is just not given to this. They're actually transferred through this molecule, ATP. So again, you eat your food, complex molecules with calories, so lots of potential energy. Your digestion breaks it apart. It enters the body. It releases its energy in cell respiration. And then anabolic processes like protein synthesis, you put that energy in the form of ATP now into the reaction to build. Okay, so this ATP is fundamental to that. So the rest of the functions that are characteristics or characteristics of life depend on this energy. All right, so responsiveness is done by the muscle. Remember that system there? I said you got your responders, and that's going to be the muscle and the endocrine, right? The glands, muscle and glands. And they do this because the nervous tissue tells them. So nervous tissue is probably one of your most energetic, expensive, next to muscle, tissues in the body. And the nervous system is very expensive because it never stops, right? It's always moving electricity. So again, one of the responses you can do is movement. So these really go together. Responsiveness is not always movement, but if you are in fact moving, well then that's going to take ATP in order to get your muscle cells to do their contraction. Developing and growing, well, growing is dependent upon protein synthesis, right? And we said synthesis requires energy. When you develop, growth is adding cell numbers and cell mass. Development is basically the process of changing the appearance or function of something. And again, that takes effort. And of course, reproduction of a cell or an organism is definitely energetic, because you've got to build all these new components, got to do a lot of synthesis. All right? So what is required for life? How do you stay alive? So we basically, in the pages 19 to 21, those are talked about. But, you could probably name these, with the exception of maybe 1, 2 of them, perhaps. But, I don't know. You definitely could get 2 of them, right? You could get that we need oxygen, and you can get the fact that we need nutrients, which includes water and food, right? The other 2 that we are required are heat and pressure. And those ones aren't normally that obvious. And I say, here just to challenge students, name 3 things you require to maintain life, and I've really just given them to you. Now explain how they keep you alive. In other words, tie them back to those characteristics. So why is oxygen needed? Well, it's needed for metabolism. It's needed when energy transfers occur. So again, the function that uses this is definitely metabolism, and then metabolism in turn affects responsiveness and movement. Okay. There are 3 groups of nutrients, macronutrients, let's be clear: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids. All right. And then and they provide building blocks. Water is just a necessary solvent and for the chemistry to occur in the body. So you got to have food and water, in other words. But so, which one is the most critical? That's always an interesting question, and that depends on perspective. I generally give carbohydrates a very high ranking, but proteins, equally high as far as use in the body. What do the macronutrients provide? Again, this is proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. They provide energy and they provide building blocks, right? What are the micronutrients? Well, and here again, your book might say, water, macronutrients, micronutrients is your 3 groups. And the macronutrients, again, are proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. Micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. And then the opportunities for responsiveness and movement, okay? So here, right, so these are the characteristics: responsiveness and movement, and we're tying them to those requirements. Okay? Oxygen, nutrients, heat, and pressure. So heat is temperature, right? We really, we talk about cold, but cold is really just the absence of heat, right? It's always about heat, right? And so we have some differences here in temperature, just to remind you of that. But you exist personally in a very narrow range of temperature. And the reason you do, of course, is because you your chemical reactions occur best there. And the reason they occur the best there is because that's where you have adequate molecular movement. So you have to maintain this, and the way you maintain this narrow range is by producing heat, right? And so responsiveness I give you here would be really captured in this, because if you're too hot or too cold, you can respond. You can change the circumstance. You can sense it, and you can do something about it. Responsiveness, all right? And so if you're too hot, you sweat and you dilate your blood vessels. If you're too cold, you constrict and you shiver, right? The last requirement besides heat is pressure. And so pressure does movement. So I know we said movement can be, the whole organism, but a lot of times the movement we're really focusing on is movement in the body of fluids and molecules. So you also exist in a narrow range, right, of pressures. What is pressure? Well, pressure is force, right? It's a push on something. So generally it depends on the container we're in, but it's the molecules pushing against containers, all right? And what does it do? Well, pressure is the force that ends up moving, right? Moving these molecules. Why is there a narrow range? Well, if pressure is excessive, it can rupture, right, your tissues. Think your blood vessels, aneurysms, all right? And if pressure is too low, it's not enough force to move things. Think about circulating blood, all right? So here, I picked this up on the third video, and I go back through this, but how do you survive in a constantly changing world? Right? Because you've got to maintain these functions we just talked about, right? Organization, metabolism, responsiveness, movement, growth, development, reproduction. And you've got to get your requirements to help you do this. So when you are getting those requirements, bringing stuff from the outside world in, which you have to do because you need the raw materials and you need the energy because you don't make energy, right? Not a plant, okay? You change the circumstances in the body. You change the amounts of chemicals and the temperature and the pressures and the pHs, okay? But to survive, you have to maintain a balance called homeostasis. So homeostasis is this process of staying balanced, all right? And so I say here that this operates around a set point or an average, something. So for temperature, 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, right? If we're talking about blood pH, it's 7.35 to 7.45, so 7.4 is an average, right? And I just gave you the range of variation. How much can it change, right? And there are a lot of things that stay in homeostatic constant in you. So I gave you, this idea of heat and pH. Just think about all the other things in you that have to stay balanced. So I say, again, thinking about this balance, you want to remember that you're a lot of fluids, right? All this movement, you're moving a lot of fluids and molecules in those fluids. So there's about 42 liters worth of fluid in your body, and it's separated. And so we talk about some of this solutions. Again, remember, a solution is molecules, chemical molecules in water, right? So some part solute, the chemical, and some part water, right? So we talk about the solutions inside the cells and call them intra, within the cell, and those outside the cell. So in this cartoon, the blood is extracellular, the interstitial fluid is extracellular, and then you have things like lymph fluid and cerebrospinal fluid, right? And a few other compartments of fluid. Well, it turns out they're not basically completely separated. They're not impermeable to each other. So they influence each other. And so the most likely scenario is that something you eat or drink comes in through the blood, and the blood and extracellular fluid is affected, and that in turn affects the interstitial, and in turn affects the intracellular. Right? And these are always moving across membranes, which we'll talk a whole lot about in chapter 3. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this and can hear it, more importantly, and please ask any questions.